Hey everybody, so this is going to be the demo that goes along with assignment 9 on Illustrator. So I have a few examples here. None of these I would consider necessarily final diagrams or finished in any way, but they're just kind of starts and ideas and an approach that you could take in your diagram process. This one here is not a diagram at all, these are just people. So a great resource to find online are websites that have silhouette people, which is a term you can just Google. Of course, always be careful about what you download online, but I found this one that seemed to work pretty well. And each one of these is just a vector output that you can take and copy and paste into another file. So that's just something to be aware of and a good thing to start collecting. So this process is really going to begin, at least for this assignment, using Rhino. So I have 3 different little compositions here that are sort of diagrammatic model compositions of a project that I've been designing for myself. It's a carport, so it has several layers of construction. So the first diagram here is just sort of a simple box volume, and if we look around, we can see it's just a couple different boxes. They have a small amount of offset between each other, and that's just so that they can really sort of be read as separate. And this would be sort of an approximation of program. Circulation here, outdoor space, indoor space, whatever it may be. The next one, this is just sort of the exterior screening elements, the storage that's at the rear, and something to represent circulation moving through the space. And the final one is a structural diagram. So these are all the sort of structural members that we would need to actually construct this thing. So in this case, I've gone about a sort of diagramming process of removing elements from the image so that you can focus on other elements. It's often a process that I think is effective for diagramming, where by doing this, you allow the focus to be on specific things that you're interested in. So in each image, in the last image here, we're really only looking at the structure. Because we have the other images, because we get a general sense of the whole building, the form of the structure is most of the building, we're not sort of lacking in information. I think this guy here might struggle to have enough information if, circulation probably doesn't really help us. We have the general form of the thing that, again, seeing the other components of this help us sort of fill out the picture of what this thing is. But it's always a balance you have to play. Sometimes it's worth including other sort of bits of the model or other elements in order to give clues as to where you're looking at a project. But anyways, so with these models, I'm going to set up a couple views. So first thing I'm going to do is go to an isometric, and I think I'm going to do northwest. Yeah. And these are the views you want to export. So actually I already have some exports here that I'm going to delete. But basically, how much you do as far as modeling goes versus how much you do purely in Illustrator is definitely something that's up to you. I tend to do more in modeling and less in Illustrator, use Illustrator more for annotation purposes, adjusting line weights, giving more clarity. But again, my personal way of working tends to be more focused on mostly getting the modeling to show what I want, and then using Illustrator as a way to sort of render that modeling. But anyways, I'm going to do a make 2D command from this view. And there's several different options in make 2D that I was going to go over. So the first is the projection. And if you click between view and C-plane, so C-plane will just project down onto the C-plane. So that would give you sort of a plan view of each one of these from above. Not exactly what we're looking for. We're looking to use the view option. The third and first angle, we're not going to cover. I never use them. Next, we have object properties. So there's 3 options here. Maintain source layers is the one that I'm going to recommend for this assignment. And I'm going to quickly just clean my file. I just did a purge command to remove all the layers because I wanted you to see them being created. So when you run a make 2D with maintain source layers, if you look on the right side of my screen where the layer panel is, as soon as I hit OK, it starts generating a whole bunch of new layers. So what we get is a sort of top layer that contains a new set of copied layers that we have originally. And this is just to keep all the line work on separate layers. So had we not done that command, but done it the other way, the make 2D from input objects, it's only going to create a single layer of all of our curves, which in this case I think is just going to be less useful. Now the curves were given color, but it's by curve and it's not by layer. So again, I'm going to go back to make 2D. We could also do by output layer, which will also do a similar thing where it's going to give the lines colors, but it will not give them individual layers. So I'm going to do maintain source layers. The next is a couple things we can select on here. So the first one I think is important is hidden lines here. And that's basically, we look at this little preview box that's right here. It allows us to see through objects and we get a dashed line in the background. Now, whether or not you want to do this is totally up to you. I think it makes more sense in simple objects and less sense in complex objects. So where we have the framing in the screen, seeing through that and getting those hidden lines is going to be way too much information because we have so many vertical and individual small lines already. Putting more lines in that will not help us. The next is scene silhouette. Now, I wish this worked as well as it could, but unfortunately I find that it has more issues that don't really make it usually worthwhile. But essentially what it would do is, I'm going to run this one more time, and it will create a new layer that is just the outline of objects. And again, it'll be here, so we end up getting a lot of things. I'm just going to select these objects, and you can see basically what scene selected, or scene silhouette I should say, is created the outline of each one of our sort of platforms. Sometimes this is really useful, sometimes it isn't. I tend to find that it isn't useful, mostly because I don't find it very accurate. So on these simple shapes that we had here, on these simple shapes of the sort of plinth that the little diagrams are sitting on, it did it fairly well. However, when you start to try to apply it to something like this screen wall, it tends to get a little confused and it doesn't end up actually making a proper silhouette line around the whole thing. So I usually find it's not consistent enough to use for diagramming purposes. So my preference again would be to use the settings that are, one second. Nope, I'm gonna do the other one, northwest. I wanted to make sure I didn't shift my camera. But make 2D. And for this particular example, I'm going to turn off scene silhouettes. I'm going to leave hidden lines on, but because it's going to be its own separate layer, I don't really have to worry about it. So if I don't like it, I can just turn that layer off. But it will make for more layers. Gonna hit OK. It'll process one last time. And we have a whole bunch of stuff. Now I'm going to go to my top view. We can see these things. So I'm not concerned at all about the line weights, the line color, or anything like that. I'm going to handle all of that in Illustrator. You know, in previous projects, we did all of that in Rhino, but for this assignment, we're going to do it in Illustrator just to kind of see the difference of methods. I think Illustrator does tend to give you a bit more sort of direct visual feedback of what you're looking at, where Rhino doesn't quite do that as well, but allows you to do it once, and then every drawing gets exported with the same settings. So there's values to each. Anyways, so to get this into Illustrator, the easiest way I find is to actually just use the export when you have something selected and navigate down to Adobe Illustrator file. You can straight export to a .ai file that opens natively in Illustrator, which is super easy. The other way of doing it is to print to PDF, but there are some disadvantages to doing that. The biggest being you don't get good layer management. So if we do this Illustrator method, we're able to actually maintain all of our source layers from Rhino that we can then use in Illustrator, which isn't always necessary, but will be useful in this situation. So actually, I'm going to name this always name your files. And it's going to pull up this dialog box. So I think by default it should probably be on snapshot to current view, but we want to, in general, always save model scale whenever possible. So in this case, 1" equals 0.125 is 1/8 of an inch. So I'm exporting this at 1/8 inch equals a foot. It's just written in reverse. So 1 foot equals 1/8 inch. So you always want this to be a lower number. You know, if you were doing 1" equal or 1/4 inch equals a foot, this would be 0.25. If you're doing something smaller, just figure out what that numerical value of the fraction is, and then you can input that there. I'm not going to make any changes here, so you can make sure your hatches export as solid fills. So if you have done fancy hatches with line work, diagonal lines or whatever, with that set, they should export into Illustrator just as fills, which is fine because you can adjust that sort of thing in Illustrator. You're given color, so RGB versus CMYK. General rule of thumb, RGB is best for things that are going to be viewed on a screen. CMYK is really set up for printing. But even then, not every printer, well, most printers do work on CMYK, but it generally is fine to submit an RGB file to a CMYK printer, and it'll do the conversion somewhere along the way. Our screens work with red, green, and blue LED diodes, so they don't perfectly display CMYK color. So if you are going to be working on a file, I do find it's easier to work in RGB color because you get more direct feedback as to what the thing looks like. And if you are going to be predominantly showing something on a screen, RGB color is going to be your best bet. So just hit OK. And it will have saved. So first thing I'm going to do is go back to my Illustrator. I'm going to create a new file. And so here you might want to switch this. I think it starts in either points, picas, or pixels, but I like inches. And I'm just going to do 11 by 17. Everything else here, so I've changed RGB color, and the raster effect is 300. This doesn't really matter a huge amount in Illustrator because you're not usually using rasters. But essentially that means if you're bringing in images, they're going to default to 300 dpi, or PPI in this case. So hit OK. Now, my screen probably looks a little different than yours. The boxes that you see on the right side of the screen probably aren't the same as the boxes that you have, but I'm going to show you how to get there. So up here in the workspace, I'm just going to default to something else. I like to use the workspace Essentials Classic. That's probably because I've always worked with this sort of Essentials Classic, because I worked with Essentials before it was Classic, and then they have a new Essentials. So these are the tool sets that I like, so these are the tool sets that I tend to use. So it may not look exactly like yours, like mine, because I have modified mine, and I thought it was going to reset. So let me just go and reset that. Reset Classic. Okay, so this is what it'll look like when you have it. And there's a few things here that I make changes to. So first off, these properties and libraries panels I don't tend to use. But I do tend to use layers, and any of these panels you can just sort of drag right to the side, and now it'll take up and live there. Assets, export editor, and artboards, I could put these here. So if you see when it goes blue around the whole box, it'll add itself as a tab, whereas if you put it above and there's a single line, it'll add itself as a new box. So I don't really for this example, I'm not going to use artboards. Artboards are like having multiple canvases inside of Illustrator, but for this I'm only going to have one. And I don't tend to use asset export very often. So next, the stroke command, which I'm going to click this little 3-line button here. which will allow me to make this larger and give me more options. And I'm going to put this below my layer. Okay, and I'll put gradient with it and transparency, because those are both going to be useful. Color swatches, I'll do the same thing. Put that above. And you can drag these things. So in general, I'm going to want a lot of room for my layers, because that's going to be one of the most useful things that we have. Let's see, I do want appearance, so I'll put that probably at the bottom. And graphic styles I don't tend to use. Now there's going to be one or two that aren't on here that we can't just drag out. So if you go to window, these items here that are checked are the items that I currently have open. So if you go to align, that'll bring up align, pathfinder, and transform. And these are all very useful commands to keep around. So I will just put that right there. So transform will allow you to move things. Align allows you to align objects. So if I have a series of, and I'm holding Alt as I drag this to create new copies. But if I have a bunch of objects, I can do the distribute and evenly distribute them. And then I could do the align them to center. And then all of my objects are perfectly spaced on a single line. So if you hover over these, it'll tell you what they do. So if you pay attention, you can align to tops. So if you have different objects that have different, say, depths in different directions, we can still align these all. If we line these to center, that'll happen. But if we line these to top, they align to top. So it makes sense. Really useful to have. The pathfinder command, which I'll use and demonstrate by bringing a couple objects in, essentially allows you to take two objects and perform what are going to be very similar to Boolean commands in Rhino. So if we click the first one, you can see they basically just combine. So very simple. You can see if you look at these, kind of what they do, they're similar to Boolean subtract, Boolean split, and Boolean addition. Anyways, so I like starting this way. One, getting this all set up because it gives you all these panels that are going to be very useful for you to use. Now, I need to find that file that I had saved. I believe it was ISO example. So I'm just going to drag it in. Now, the ISO example, when I dragged it in, created its own new window as a new file. And that's fine, because in this case, I'm actually only going to do one diagram at a time. Let me think about that. Yeah, I'll do one diagram at a time. So I'm going to take this first guy, and I could have done this maybe easier in Rhino just by only exporting one. So if you see there, I wasn't able to just select using the rectangles, but I did have the lasso selection. So I can take this, copy, and paste it into my other file. And that's just because I already have this set up for 11 by 17, so it's easy. But what I did do there is actually I lost my layers. So I take that back. I'm going to stick here because it doesn't seem to bring layers with you when you copy and paste. So I will work in this file. I thought it would bring layers. Doesn't matter too much. So here, basically all of our Make 2D layers that we had in Rhino appear here. So we turn these off. You can just hold your mouse down and drag across and it'll turn off multiple layers. And we can see that they sort of just add back in. Now this is a great way to keep organized. So if you want to have individual components turn on or off or do different things. So a good example here are going to be all the lines that we have that are part of the background, or the hidden lines, I should say. So if I decide I don't want them, I can just turn them off. In general, when working in Illustrator, I find it's easiest to lock all the layers that you're not currently working on. And a good reason for that is, so if I'm using the pen tool, and I want to, say, draw a new shape, I'm not currently on a layer, so I need to be on a layer. Put one at put something at the bottom here. I could snap to this. Now, if the layers weren't locked, I might actually snap and join and connect my new drawn shape with the one that's already there. So this just prevents that from happening. Looks like I didn't do a very good job. You see, when the pen tool has a sort of slash line next to it, that means it's going to join with the other line. So you'll make a new addition to that existing line. And that tends to happen a lot when you have layers that aren't actually turned off. Anyways, once I have this shape, so shapes are given both a color for the stroke and a color for the fill, although you don't have to use a color for either. Currently, this just has a stroke that has a light gray tone on it. If I double click on this, it'll bring up color picker, so I can make that something different, make it bright red. And you see here, there's two different swatches. The one that has this sort of square cutout in the center, that'll be your line. And the other one that currently has a white box with a red slash through it, that just means there's nothing assigned, and that'll be your fill. So I'll put something, a pink tone in there, and it fills it up. So fills don't have to be just colors. We can use... So up here, we can go to swatches and we can load in things like, let's go to patterns. So there's basic graphic patterns. So there's dots. And I can drag these out. I usually just start having them hover on one side of the screen. Let's go to get more, do some lines. And I'm going to actually make a copy of this. I just hit Control C, and now I'm going to hit Control F, which actually just copies it directly on top. And the reason being is I wanted to do that so I could put a hatch pattern on top of that pink. And I can do any of the ones that are here. So if I wanted to do polka dots, I could do that at transparency if I like. So you can probably see here how you could start developing a very particular graphic style pretty quickly. So when it comes to layers, though, there's a good thing to understand, which is that layers in Illustrator, like in Photoshop and like in InDesign, stack. So we have a vertical stack here on the right side of the screen. Anything that is on the bottom layer, which I currently have named as layer 16, cannot ever appear above anything above it in the stack. So if you see here, all these lines are going to appear above that new shape that I created. If I create, say, a new shape right now, and I'm going to give it, I'm just going to flip this so I can get a color. So you can see I'm still working on the same layer, layer 16, but this object is now sitting on top of that object. I can right click and go to arrange and do send to back, or send to back, or send backward. So I'm just going to send it back. And you can see I can reverse that order within the layer itself. However, I could do the opposite and do bring to front, but I can never bring it in front of anything that isn't on this layer. I can only adjust with bring to front, send to back, the ordering on the actual layer that I'm working on, so it doesn't affect its hierarchy compared to any of the other layers that are above it or below it. So that's always a good thing to keep in mind. If you can't figure out why lines are running across, it could be either the sort of stacking within the layer, or it could be the stacking of layers that you have already. Okay, so that was one thing. The next, I'm going to bring this guy aside for a second, and I think I'm going to do a gradient on this. So gradients are another pretty useful thing that you can do. And so there's a bunch of default gradients. I'm just going to start with one of them. It doesn't matter too much because I'm going to make some changes anyways. I started with the pink, so I might as well do that. If you double click, so because there's two boxes down here, one can be in front, one can be in back. Whichever one is in front, if you make a selection of a color, that will be the one that receives it. So we have the gradient now. We can adjust how it's applied. So I can make it go from one direction to the other. And then I can also, in my gradient tab on the right side of the screen, which if I don't have a gradient tab, I can navigate to through the window panel here and just go to gradient. I could make adjustments to this. So if I wanted it to be maybe a bit lighter, I can lighten that up a little bit. Oops. And I could change the other color, make that something like that. The gradient tool also allows you to go in different directions. So I just did a sort of straight regular gradient like this. But I could also do a gradient based on a radius. That probably, for this edge right here, makes maybe less sense, although I don't know if a gradient makes sense at all in this case, especially this weird color one that I'm doing. But I think, especially for this assignment, I encourage you just to experiment and try out different things. So now I'll just put this guy back and see how it looks with dots over top. I'd say it looks interesting. Again, a very distinct graphic style that you could start developing. Okay, so that was one thing. Next, let's talk about manipulating the stuff that we've brought in. So clearly we have lines, but we don't have really any fills or anything that make these start to read as sort of three-dimensional objects. So there's a couple ways we can deal with this. I'm going to create a new layer and put it at the top. And we could just come in here and use these as snaps to trace out a new object. Now clearly I'm creating a dot object right now. But I could start creating shapes that way. I could use the existing geometry that's already here. So I could find that layer, I'm going to unlock it and go to that layer to work on it. All of these came in as individual curves that are not connected, but I could select the curves that make up the outside of this object. I then hit Control J or Command J on Mac, which will bring them all together. And I'm just going to flip the color and the stroke here. This little tool allows you to swap them in or out. So now it has a stroke to it that runs across the whole thing. And I'm also going to send that to back because I want to be able to select, there should be some other curves in here. I think I have them selected right now. Nope. There we go. Because I wanted to also bring out some edges on this thing. So the overall object, basically these curves were already here. They were just the same color, so we couldn't see them. This overall object itself doesn't have a line weight, so I could also give that one. And I might give it a slightly thicker one, because then we have this sort of nice line weight hierarchy of a thinner line here where this box is folded over an edge, and a thicker line that's sort of creating that sort of silhouette for this individual box. If we wanted to give this some, say, three-dimensional shading, we could. I'm going to go to a different layer just so I can keep things separate. And I might just do one side. Oops. Not actually drawing, I don't think. Try that one more time. It's not drawing because my layer currently, although it's unlocked, it's not actually visible, and you can't draw on something that's invisible. But I'm just going to use these anchor snaps to draw out one side of this. And I could then take this object and I could lower the opacity, which would give me some shading. The other way I could do it is I could just not adjust opacity at all, but set this to a darker green. Or I could use a similar pattern. So if I wanted to do shading based on dots, or maybe I'd want to do shading based on, let's go back to basic graphic And let's do some lines. So we could do some hatch shading. Now, if I don't like the way these lines are appearing, if I don't like the scale, so I could go to the scale tool, which is this guy here. Oops. Where'd it go? This one. And if I just click anywhere in it, hit enter, it'll ask me if I want to scale it. So if I type in 250, it's going to scale the whole object. But right here, I can do turn transform objects off. And now it's only going to scale the pattern. But I could also do, say, 25 and make that a really tight line pattern that we see there. I could do the same thing with the rotation tool. Right, this guy. Click on it, hit enter, and then I could do a rotation. Again, with transform objects turned off, 45 degrees, maybe 30. There we go. And that could work. Now, I currently have this at a low opacity, so let me turn it up. Looks like I actually have a line weight on this of red, so I'm actually just going to go in here and set the line weight to the white box with the red line going through it, which will just make that line weight disappear. So I could do hatching this way, and I could do a different type of hatching on this edge to make it a sort of a lighter or a darker hatch if I want to give 3 degrees of hatching shading on this object. But that's kind of how I'd go about this process. So let's turn on some more layers. So I could do something similar for the sort of ground surface. The hidden lines that we have. So it looks like I have these layers, no, not that one. Sometimes you have to select through and figure out which ones are which. Okay, so that's a hidden line. Just turning them all off. Okay, so the hidden line layers themselves, now that I know which ones they are, which are these here. Nope, not that one. I'm going to turn them back on. And actually, I'll just turn them all on because I can do this an easier way. So I'm going to unlock these. With any line selected, so I have all of my hidden layer lines look the same. They're the same color, they're the same stroke width, everything. I can use the selection filter to select all of them. So if I go to same, and then I go down to, let's go to stroke, well, let's just do appearance, because that'll make a selection based on only the ones that are identical. It's also selecting these up here, which that's fine. And I could now make adjustments to these, so turn the line weight down to something much lighter. And I could also click on the stroke tool here. The same thing also appears on the right side because we set up this earlier. And I could set these to be a dash line. Now it allows me to control that dash, so the default is 12 points, but I could make it something smaller, 3 points. I could define the gap, so if I wanted a really large gap, so I could do 12. And then if we zoom in, essentially we have a dot and a large space and then a dot. We could also do the opposite. We can make it, oops, not 12, but make this into 2. So then we'll have a sort of large line, small gap, large line, small gap. And again, we can sort of continue adjusting this. We could add in more different dot orders. So we could do sort of small dot, large dot, huge dot, small dot, whatever. Doesn't really matter too much. But I do want, if I'm going to use hidden lines, them to be very much a background line. I'm just going to make that even lighter, so 0.125. And you can see we now have a sort of very light backgrounding of that information. And again, I may even decide to turn all of it off. That's just something that you'll have to decide for what your composition is. But I do like them better already. But I am going to lock all of them. So let's see what to do next. Do some text. So if I want to add text to this, it's always good to add text as an annotation layer in and of itself. And in general, I think it's always good to put that at the top. There may be times where you want it to be behind something else, but usually not. Usually it goes to the top. So there's two ways you can draw out a text box. You can just click and drag, and it'll make a large text box that will automatically fill with lorem ipsum text. And this is just meaningless text that appears visually to look like correct text, but doesn't actually say or mean anything. It is not Latin. It is a made-up language. The other way is if you click once, it will give you an area to start typing. So we could say for this project, write parking. And I'm going to just do capitals. I'm going to do the same thing here, write parking in this box. Now, because we did this two different ways, there's different impacts on it. So the first text right here that I did just by clicking once and starting to type, if I make adjustments to this box, you can see it changes the size and scale of the text itself. Whereas if I make adjustments to this box, it works more like InDesign, where this is just the box that will fill with text. So it's two different ways of doing text that are both of the same command. It just depends whether you click and drag or just click once. All right, so either way, I'm just going to use one of these. To make this feel like it's more part of the isometric image that we already have, I'm going to go to Effects, 3D, Bevel and Extrude. It's going to look weird for a second, but I want to go down to these isometric views. So let's do isometric right, and I'm going to turn off the extrusion, set that to 0, and you can see here our text is now aligned to this isometric angle that we have. So I can just hit, I'm going to turn shading off. It doesn't matter for this, but will matter later on. So I could put this, say, right there. So maybe that volume is being defined as my parking volume. I could do the same thing. Let's take this. Let's make some new text. I'll do it the other way, actually. So click once. Oops. Click once. And trans. Deleting all the other ones. So then I'll do the opposite. So go to Effect, 3D, Bevel and Extrude. And this time do isometric left, turn off the depth, and hit OK. So now you can start to see how this could be useful for coding and codifying your image. So we can do the same thing with, let's make an arrow. So I'm just going to use the line segment tool, which is similar to the pen tool, except it only does a single segment. And I'll give that a large stroke. So how about 14? And then under the stroke tool, which is also over here again, I can give it an arrowhead. So let's give it this one, arrowhead 8. Now it looks really weird because the arrowhead is so huge right now. So I'm just going to adjust the scale of that to be 12. No. Way too small. 30? Okay. So you could draw out your own arrow if you want. In this case, I'm just going to use this because it works fine. I'm going to rotate it so it's up. I think that'll be easier later on. But I'm going to do the same command that I did previously. So 3D extrude bevel and set that to isometric top in this case. And you can see now it is aligned. If I want, in this case, maybe I do want to have some depth. So the depth is that extra extrusion that we have, but maybe it's only 10 pixels. You can see here, now we have this sort of three-dimensional arrow. We could also keep it at 0. Let's turn that down to 10. So there's shading that's being applied. So if you see the edges of that arrow get different coloring. So there's a couple different shading options you can do. You can do diffuse shading or plastic shading. These are probably going to look mostly the same for you until you open up more options right here, which allows you to actually adjust how that shading is being applied. So if I want to make, say, one side lighter than the other, basically kind of place where I want the sun and how I want it to illuminate this, and it will update. And plastic shading just gives you a little bit more control of sort of the reflectivity of the appearance of it. No shading will just extrude like this, which can also look pretty fine too. So that's just sort of personal preference. I'm going to stick to no depth and just leave it at that. And bring this guy over here. I'll give it a, I'm just going to go, so I want to make this thing into an object. So I'm just going to go to Object, Expand Appearance. So instead of it being a line that is an arrow, I can now make it into a couple shapes. Now these shapes, you see here, there's a separate shape for the arrowhead versus the line base itself. But I can use that Pathfinder tool that I mentioned earlier to merge them into one. And the reason I want to do that is if I apply a line weight to this, and I need to make that line weight something different so we can see it. Didn't have the thing selected. We get a line going across the center, which I don't exactly want. So if I just do the merge shapes, you can see it's now just one shape. It doesn't have that line going across it. I probably would not want it to be quite so strong. And I'll just do this button here. Will always default to giving you a white solid fill with a black line with a line weight set to 1. And sometimes that's nice. But I'll just do a pink and do the same. So go to the gradient tool just to adjust the gradient, and now I should be able to. It doesn't want me to adjust the gradient. Oh well. Anyways, so we have this. There's a few more things we might want to do. So we could say go to Stylize and do a drop shadow. The default one I think looks fairly weird and soft. So if we could change the opacity down to something lighter, make it a little bit more subtle. To the offset here, this is how far away the shadow is. For these type of drawings, tend to find only offsetting in one direction seems to work pretty well. The blur here, which I think is a little extreme right now, I'm just gonna turn off. You can see if you don't have a blur, you get the exact shadow. But if you put in any number here, which has to be very low for it to minimally affect it, we'll start blurring those edges. But this is kind of personal preference as to which one you like better. I tend to like the crisp shadow better than having the blur. And the greater you increase this, the higher the arrow appears, as you've just given it sort of more of an offset. So again, we can use arrows. We could do the same thing with objects. So if we decided we wanted to make a path, sorry, I'm drafting this out and not thinking very well, not thinking straight. So the pen tool, which is here, has some very useful features. So if we just drag out, it'll make straight lines. If we drag out and hold, it'll start making a Bezier curve, which is a curve defined by these, at each point, a extrusion of that line, sort of a tangent. And we can make smooth curves that way. So if we wanted to, say, make a path that goes around this thing, we could do so, kind of like that. I'm going to turn off, just want to have a line weight right now, and I will then make that have an arrowhead as well. Oh, wrong one. Sometimes you don't know which is the beginning arrow, which is the end. And I'll make this something thicker. So you could show a path like this. We could do the same command and try to make this into something isometric, but it's going to look a little weird because we're kind of drawing on the isometric view anyways. So if we just do the extrude and bevel, you can see here it's not really going to work very well. If we had drawn this in plan, it would work fine, but because we were drawing it on the isometric view, it just doesn't really make sense. But we could do the same thing here of object, expand appearance, and then merge those and copy this guy. and that looked all kinds of weird, so that broke for some reason. Doesn't matter too much. Okay, so we could also drag in other images. So if we want to use something like a texture that we have, we can do that as well. So I have a texture. This is just some concrete that I can just drag in. And these are all textures you can find online. This is just a collection that I have going. It's probably one I've showed before or used before. But I just drag this guy in. And since we are working in an isometric view, to make this texture appear to be part of this is actually going to be fairly easy. So I'm just going to do exactly the same process I've been doing. I'll do 3D extrude and bevel. And I'm just going to set this to be, let's do the top view. And definitely don't want extrusion right now. Just want it to be a concrete plane. And I will shrink this. I'm going to lower the opacity so I can see what I'm doing. So I also don't know what layer I put this on. I probably want this to be on a bottom layer. So I'm going to create a new layer. I'm actually going to, I can move things between layer by on the right side here, this little box. Anytime you have something selected, you can drag that box from layer to layer. So I brought it to this one, and I put it at the bottom of my stack. So everything else appears above it. So I want this concrete, which is a crazy oversized texture, to just appear on the ground. So I'm going to lock everything else except for the layer that I'm working on, just so I don't end up snapping to things that I don't intend to. And now I will just start drilling using the pen tool and using snaps. So I just want to draw out where I want this thing to be. Now you can see here it's starting to do a black fill. I don't really care too much what the fill is because I'm not really going to use that fill. But I will care if it starts to make it harder to do this, if I can't see what I'm snapping to. But you can see also, unlike the way Rhino does fills or hatches, Illustrator does not need to have a completely enclosed box. You can have an open side, and it'll just try to fill it however it can. So anyways, I'm going to select that shape that I just drew and the original object. Make sure I did that right. So this shape and the object. And now I can just go to make clipping mask, and it's going to use the whatever object is on top to clip the object below. And now we have that perfectly aligned. I can set that opacity. If I double click into it, I can adjust it. So I can double click until I get down to this base layer, and I can raise that opacity again. And now we've got some ground texture that is giant oversized concrete panels, which might be something we'd end up liking. I'm going to go in and copy that shape because I'm going to use that again. So if I wanted to then add some shading to this, I could. I've already copied that shape, so I'm going to hit Control F to paste it on top. And now I will apply a new gradient. I'll just do this default gradient to start with. Go to the gradient tool, and instead of doing from pink to other pink, I'm just going to do black to white, and I'm going to get rid of this middle point just by selecting it and hitting the trash can. And you can see here I now have a gradient. I maybe not going to go from complete black. I'll go from oops, do that again. Oh, it wants to select something. Anyways, it's fine. So I'm going to actually set this from normal to the layer type of multiply. So now it's actually applying to the texture below, and I can lower that opacity. And then we can just go and get some shuttle shading going. So you can kind of actually do all of your shading, if you wanted to, with gradients. You don't need to use a renderer to get shading out of things. So I could do the same thing for, let's just do this surface on this green object here. So although we did one side with hatching, we'll do the other side using shading through gradients. Now it's not going to appear, and that's because that object is on top of it. So I'm going to need to move that up. I'm just going to create a new layer and bring it to that layer and make sure it's above my green. So I'm just going to adjust this. Maybe I'll make it something like that. And again, set this to multiply, set the opacity down to something light. And you can see I've given some shading to the object. All of this is vector shading, so it's all completely smooth. This will all essentially print at infinite scale. The only exception being I did bring in a raster file, which does look a little fuzzy right now. And raster files just don't scale perfectly, whereas vector files do. So I could never make this print off at 1,000 feet by 1,000 feet with that raster image, but everything else vector would scale up infinitely and look good. So let's go back and make some adjustments to some other things. So under annotation, if I select this text, I can also always go back and adjust things that I did before. So down here under appearance, and again, if you don't have the appearance panel, go to window, open up appearance. I can click on the extrude bevel that I had done. So if I wanted to go back and say, maybe I decided I wanted to give this some depth, make my text appear to be 3D. Seems to be too much. 5, okay. And it doesn't look very good right now, but that's because we were extruding black text. So what if we made this into kind of orange tone? And you can see here, because of the, again, under extrude and bevel, the fact that it had plastic shading turned on, it looks kind of like that. So if we just go back to diffuse, so it's only going to now just have the original color. But if we were to give this a line weight, well, it doesn't exactly work. So what we'd actually have to do is take this and do the same command we had done before, which is object, expand appearance. And now if we were to give this a line, we can see we get the outline of this text. Whether or not we like this or not, that's total preference. It does start to get a little silly when you do things like this, but it is a way you can do things if you're interested in it. So oftentimes another way we might do this is say we want to tag something and put a tag above it. So I'm just going to draw a line. Maybe I'd give that line a stroke. And we have a couple things in here as well that are useful. So we have the cap. So I'm going to zoom into this line in a second. So if we look at this, with the stroke selected, we could make the cap rounded. So we get these sort of rounded segments. We can do the same thing. We don't have any corners on this, but whether the corners become rounded or sharp can be adjusted here. But I could also then put text. So oftentimes you might have callouts of text like this, which is a pretty useful way of doing things. 4 is too big. And there we go. And I could decide to, again, put a arrowhead on this thing, again, under stroke. Although I might like some fun ones in here. The circle one sometimes is nice. Have to figure out which I don't want on that end, but I would want it here. And this might be better a color or something other than black. Okay, so I think that's going to be about all I wanted to cover in this. So again, this isn't exactly how you need to do your own. I just wanted to cover as many possible techniques as I could in a sort of brief period of time, tools you might use for isometric diagramming in architecture and interior design. Again, bringing things in. So these people here, which are, again, are just silhouette people I found online, you can quite easily just copy and paste them and put them into your scene. Now, there is no way to perfectly scale them, but we can get a sort of approximate scale. I could also do the same command as before, 3D, extrude and bevel. Definitely don't want to give these guys any three-dimensionality to them, but I could decide that I want to make them on axes. so they look like they fit in the scene. Let's see. Oh yeah, so one other thing I wanted to mention, and that would be this website called Adobe Color. When dealing with color in diagrams, a consistent color scheme is always a good idea. Now you can certainly do everything in grayscale, and that can be just fine. But if you are going to use color, unless you think that you're very proficient in color and really understand it and can make a color scheme you really like, this can be a great place to get ideas, but also to make sort of calculated color schemes that will probably always work well together. So the default thing that should come up is the create tool, which allows you to create color schemes. So you can drag these points around and it's going to create color schemes based on whatever point you're dragging around. So there's always going to be one point, there's a little triangle on it, and that's going to be your sort of defining point. In this case, we're doing an analogous color scheme. Monochromatic is just going to do colors that are all the same hue, but different tones. We could do a triad. This is one of, I think, oftentimes a really nice looking color scheme. So it pulls essentially a triangle across the color wheel that we see here, which oftentimes makes interesting looking color schemes. Complementary pulls colors on the opposite sides of the color wheel. These are going to be your highest contrast color schemes that you can create. As inherently anything on the opposite of the color wheel is going to have heavy contrast with anything on the other side. Split complementary kind of does something similar, but instead of doing the exact complementary, it takes an equal spacing on either side of the color on the color wheel, the opposite side of it. And there's a few other ones in here. But the other thing you can do is you can look at other people's color schemes. So if you go to Explorer, right now they're promoting their sort of Pantone classic blue thing. However, if you go to all sources on the right side, color themes, you can go to most popular, all, most used, random. I'm just gonna hit random. And you just get a whole bunch of color schemes. So if you see one of these you like, say I like this guy here. It's pretty bold. So you can integrate this directly into all the Adobe programs because this is an Adobe software. However, oftentimes I find the easiest thing to do is just download it as a JPEG. It's kind of the simple, dumb way of doing things, but sometimes simple and dumb are good ways of doing things. But I'm just going to drag this in and it'll bring that JPEG in. So we also get the hash values here that we could just type in if we want to get that exact color, but I didn't want to do that. I brought it someplace else. So I'm just going to copy this, bring it into this file. I'm going to pull this up because I just want to use this as a reference. So for all of my colors, so if I want to adjust something, let me find the right layer. And this is why, so layers are really useful, but they're really useful up until the point where you end up with too many of them and you can't tell what's happening anymore. And unfortunately, all the Make 2D layers come with Make 2D as the first word, so it can be really hard to keep track. But if I go to this layer that has these green objects on it, I could hit the circle on the right side, which allows me to make a selection of everything in that layer. And then I can use the eyedropper tool here to pick, say, that blue, or that yellow, or that orange, red, purple. I think I'll do the blue. But I could essentially do the same thing for all of these. So anything in the scene, I can start to use this color scheme for, which is a great way to keep organized. So I think there's an example here where I've done that. Yep, this one. Different color scheme, but essentially my objects and my annotation are all using the sort of suggested colors here, which can be a great way to keep things consistent. Doesn't really matter what color scheme you do, but if you start off with one in the beginning, you're more likely to be consistent as you move through the process. And again, there's hundreds of thousands of options on that Adobe Color website, and it's a great place to start and get an idea. Let's see what else. Just going over some things if I didn't cover something, looking at these other files I've done in the past. So, you know, this is one of the other ones I had done sort of a sample demo when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to cover. A couple other things of like, so in this case, I wanted to create a background image. So that's something I'll do in our file. So say I want to do, how about a gradient background? So I'm going to create a rectangle. I'm going to make a new layer at the very bottom. There we go. And snap to the edges, create a rectangle. Now let's create a gradient, and I'm just going to apply standard gradient and go in and edit it. So again, I'm going to get rid of one of my points. And this time, when I click one of the edges, I'm going to click the color picker right below it. And I'll do, how about this red? It's going to be a really bold gradient. And then the same thing for the orange. So now I can, again, use something that's part of the color scheme that I have. And I'll set the gradient to be just like that. Now, if I was doing this, I might want my composition to stand off of that background. So either in another layer, which might be a good idea, I can do a sort of outline of the whole object, kind of like that scene silhouette that happened from Rhino, which again, I think the easiest way is just going to be to trace out a new one as opposed to trying to use the lines that are here, because oftentimes they're either slight areas where they're not perfectly connected, or other things going on that just make it easier sometimes to just draft it out. And it doesn't take too long. Now this was a simple shape too, which if it weren't simple, it might be less advantageous to go this route of actually just drawing this out one more time. Now you can see here, it's just going to use whatever the color that I used last, which happened to be the gradient. So I'm just going to click the white. And now I've given a stroke that goes around the whole thing, as well as a sort of white background for it to sit on, giving us a little contrast. Okay. I think that's about it. I mean, in general, some other good principles are, with all the things you brought in, oftentimes one of the first things I do will be select all of them and just make sure that the color stroke that they're using is black, because usually you don't want the colors that are coming out of your layer organization. And the other thing I might do is set them to be a lighter tone. Make sure I don't think I actually changed anything just now. So I'm just going to lock all the layers I adjusted and take. Actually, if I do that now, I'll add layers or add lines to things I didn't want. Whatever. So oftentimes the layers that come in by default are going to be way too heavy. They're just arbitrary values oftentimes. So usually I start by making everything 0.25, just to sort of keep things a little bit lighter, a little bit cleaner. And then the other thing would be with anything that has a stroke, making that stroke color black as a starting point instead of dealing with whatever color it currently is set as. Now you can see here some of these things are set to a value of 1, which is way too high. And that's really happening because I wasn't keeping organized as I moved through. But again, you can start to see how you can form some pretty nice looking diagrams using a combination of hatches, three-dimensional text, some texturing, gradients, of course, I think are a pretty useful tool in Illustrator. And you could spend a lot of time doing this, so it just depends on how much you want to do for this particular type of diagram and what you want to show. Again, I was just trying to show as many tools as possible, so this doesn't necessarily lead to, say, a finished product right now that I think is a beautiful image, but hopefully it showed a variety of steps that you could start taking in order to create an Illustrator diagram. So that'll be it for this one.